Wow, it sure has been a while, huh? But I'll discuss that more at the end of the video. For now, it's time to talk about Jimmy Neutron.
3, 2, 1.
Got a blast!
I was going to begin this by saying that I'm sure most of you already know what this show is, but I realize that there's a distinct possibility that some don't, or only know it for some memes. So to keep this brief, Jimmy Neutron is a show about a boy genius who tends to invent various things, and of course many of these things happen to go wrong somehow, but he usually manages to save the day. In fact, while we'll get to this later, Jimmy is usually the cause of many of the conflicts in the series. Not all of them, mind you, but out of the entire series, I'd say a good chunk of them are unintentionally caused by Jimmy's antics. Jimmy is usually joined by some of the other main characters, including his parents, his friends Carl and Sheen, and Libby and Cindy tend to often make appearances as well. Of course, this isn't every character, but we'll get to each character as we go along here. Let's actually talk about those characters briefly. I'm not going to go over Jimmy again, since he's the main character of the show. Carl. Carl is one of Jimmy's best friends, alongside Sheen. Carl is a huge fan of llamas and also has about 3,000 different ailments, which makes it interesting that he's one of Jimmy's prime test subjects for his latest and at times dangerous inventions. Carl is usually well-intentioned, but sadly isn't all that bright. Also, later throughout the series, you'll notice that Carl has a certain interest in Jimmy's mom. Sometimes it's subtle, many times it really isn't, because do I need to show the jar clip here? This is already weird enough, but I think the internet has made this scene even worse. Next up we have Sheen. Sheen is Jimmy's other best friend, but unlike Carl, wears his stupidity on his sleeve. Though ironically, I think he might be smarter than Carl, even if just barely. Sheen actually seems to show some interest in Jimmy's inventions compared to Carl, even if only because it looks like it will do something cool, or it reminds him of something from his favorite show, Ultra Lord. Speaking of which, half of Sheen's bit is that he's completely obsessed with Ultra Lord. Honestly, if I had to pick between Carl or Sheen as the better character, I'd have to go with Sheen since he's funnier and ultimately more interesting. Then we have Cindy, who's actually sort of like Jimmy's rival. She used to be the smartest person in her class until Jimmy came along and trounced her at pretty much everything involving academics. She's certainly more well-rounded compared to Jimmy though, so she'll still win at things like athletics, which will cause Jimmy to try and get ahead of her with his inventions. Also, Cindy has two designs, her movie design and her series design, and I honestly think the latter is better, but maybe that's because I'm more used to it. You'll understand why I'm mentioning that she has two designs much later on into this video. One other thing of note is that despite their rivalry, Jimmy and Cindy are pitched as having a sort of love interest between the two of them. It's rather subtle throughout the first portions of the series, to a point where Jimmy screams at the prospect of having gotten married to her in a sort of bad future, but by the end of the series, it isn't even close to subtle. Honestly, I think overall, of the 5 main characters, Cindy is sort of my least favorite. It seems like many of her appearances revolve around her and Jimmy, which means that her appearances will usually fit into one of 3 categories. Their competitive nature against one another, which will often result in her making fun of Jimmy when something goes wrong or simply just insulting him, her actually caring or trying to help, or the later portions of the series where the not remotely subtle interest plots are taking priority. So let's move on to Libby. Okay, so take Cindy's character, but tone down some of the extremes, and you get Libby. Libby isn't the smartest student in class, unlike Jimmy and Cindy, but she isn't really trying to be, instead being far more interested in things like music. However, because this rivalry between her and Jimmy doesn't exist, this also means she isn't constantly attacking him. Another thing to note is Libby also gets sort of love interest subplot in later episodes, albeit with Sheen, and it seems much more organic compared to the one between Jimmy and Cindy. But okay, enough about those characters, since we have a couple of others to cover. Let's start off with Hugh. Alright, Hugh. If you're watching this video, even if you're not very familiar with the series itself, you probably know or have at least seen Hugh before. Despite him being a side character in the series, Hugh is the big breakout character of Jimmy Neutron. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if Hugh were to be more popular than Jimmy himself. Hugh is honestly such a hilarious character. He loves his ducks, genuinely tries his best to help raise Jimmy, even if he isn't the best at it, and has so many funny moments throughout this series. His character, even if it's more often than not just him messing around, is also more developed compared to his wife, and even certain other characters in the series. Hugh is the meme character, which I honestly think he's earned, and is also my absolute favorite character in the entire show. Now then, there's one villain I'm going to mention in here as well, that being Professor Calamitous, the man who could never finish anything. Why am I mentioning only him though? Well, between him and one other group, they're the only villains who ever pop up with any sort of frequency. Calamitous' main trait is that he's somewhat incompetent due to being unable to finish anything, causing many of his plans to fail. That actually makes it all the more impressive when he almost succeeds in said plans, come to think of it. And now I guess there's one other character I can discuss, that being Evil Jimmy. Evil Jimmy was created when Jimmy made an invention to split his personality into several other characters. While this was mainly resolved in the very same episode, Evil Jimmy managed to use his tricks to stick around. It's a shame that Evil Jimmy only got a couple of notable episodes in the series, given that he's just as smart as standard Jimmy. I mean, he was able to create an entire alternate world where everyone is evil. This is such a good character that I wish had more appearances. Or, I guess, such an evil character that I wish had more appearances. Alright, and those are some of the more well-known characters out of the way. There are other characters, but they either only appear a couple of times ever, are background characters that have little to nothing to talk about, or they're a brobot. The show got a feature-length movie, followed by 3 seasons of the TV series. Oh yeah, and a spin-off show. But we'll get to that towards the end of the video. Let's actually talk about that movie quickly, since it is the start of the series. The movie does a lot of world building for the series, and involves Jimmy wanting his parents gone so that he could go to the opening of a brand new theme park, Retroland. Well, it turns out his wish came true, because a toaster satellite that Jimmy made gets picked up by a race of alien eggs called the Yolkians. They abduct all the adults. Well, apparently it's on Earth, but this feels like a very Retroville-specific event. Also, remember how I said Jimmy would be the catalyst for many of the conflicts in the series? Well, this is one of them. After partying for a while, everyone in town realizes they miss their parents, and so they all build rockets to go rescue them. Now, I'm going to skip a lot of the movie and jump straight to the part where they get to the Yolkian homeworld, get imprisoned, break out, and then manage to save their parents from a giant alien chicken, which is apparently the equivalent of a god for the Yolkians. I will say that I personally like much of the ending portions of the movie. It's a pretty good balance of silly, actually decent pacing, and generally interesting, which is something I can't really say for the rest of the movie. Yet, honestly, the movie is one of the weaker portions of the entire series. I think the whole movie angle forced it to take itself a bit more seriously than it needed to, which stands in stark contrast to the normal episodes. It isn't a bad movie, but it's ultimately just sort of okay. If it were a standalone movie, while I don't think it would be amazing, I don't think I'd really have many gripes either. In short, it was alright. I think the only reason to really watch the movie is for world building and not much more. Otherwise, if you want something really entertaining, just watch the series. But before we move on, since we've seen some of what this series is going to look like, let's talk about the design of this series. So for context, the series began in 2001 with the movie, and went up to 2006 with the TV show. So the good news is that I could compare this to a slightly more advanced Toy Story in terms of design. The bad news is that I can compare this to a slightly more advanced Toy Story. Now, look, I don't think Toy Story looks bad or anything, but that was also made several years earlier, all the way back in 1995. The Jimmy Neutron movie came out the same year as Shrek, just in case anyone forgot. I still think that Jimmy Neutron is a pretty decent looking series, and I've definitely seen worse CG done much later on, but let's not pretend it's cutting edge or anything. It has a sort of PS2 or PS3 cutscene look to certain things, which isn't bad, especially for the time. But we'll get back to some of this later. In short, however, I don't think that this is a bad look for the series. In fact, I like it, especially in hindsight. Now, one gripe I have, much like with dinosaurs, which I reviewed a while back, is the fact that while this show is normally episodic, there are more than a few occasions where episodes will reference back to previous ones. In fact, unlike dinosaurs, where the majority of the time you'd be fine to just watch in any order regardless, save for maybe the beginning and end, even though Jimmy Neutron is largely episodic, it's still best to just watch in a series order so that you don't run into an episode with a recurring villain that you've never seen before. Okay, so does anyone remember how in episodes of regular show things can get really bizarre or random really fast? Yeah, well that doesn't exactly happen in this show. However, I mention that because while this show has more of a slow burn to its bizarre antics compared to other shows, it can certainly get quite bizarre at times, and that isn't a bad thing either. I'm going to name some bizarre plots, and you have to tell me which one isn't from Jimmy Neutron. 1. Talking space eggs use a giant chicken to try and take over a carnival. 2. A floating granny head tries to hypnotize the residents of the town into being happy. 3. A fast food restaurant gains sentience, flies around town destroying other buildings, before flying itself directly into the sun. 4. One of the characters becomes pregnant with an alien baby. Okay, so which ones are real and which ones are fake? I'll give you a few seconds to decide. Okay, time's up. The answer is that all of them are real. To be fair, the first one should have been easy since we already talked about the Yokians earlier with the movie, but the rest of those are all equally real episodes, and they're all about as insane as you might think. For now, let's get to the series proper, starting with Season 1. I think out of the 3 seasons we have, we get more world building in Season 1, and since the movie came first, it also ends up trying to leak into the season as well. This can be seen in a couple of instances, such as trying to use the movie's Jimmy Jimmy song, which I honestly never did care for, or trying to bring back the Yokians for a multi-part special, which I'll discuss towards the end of this season. Now, just because I said there was world building in here, doesn't mean that I think there was a ton of it in this season, mainly because a lot of that was already done in the movie. But we do get some setups to specific character dynamics, or to recurring villains. Enough about that though. Let's get to the best and worst episodes of the season. So for the best episodes, I'm going to be honest and say that picking just a few was really difficult. Seriously though, in my options for the best list, I had about a dozen episodes, all of which were very close. Birth of a Salesman. This episode involves Jimmy being unable to sell chocolate for a school sale, which he wants to win so that he can go and visit Retroland. Again. Unfortunately, Jimmy is a terrible salesman, and Cindy completely beats him at this, so instead Jimmy decides to build a robot to do this for him. This obviously goes wrong though when the robot decides to start selling things off as part of the deal, mainly Jimmy's inventions. Oh yeah, and then the robot tries selling Jimmy himself, who's apparently worth about $2. I'm going to be honest, part of my enjoyment of this episode hinges on... Okay, let's be honest, you know exactly what it hinges on. And the funniest twist? At the end, Cindy and Jimmy both manage to tie, so they end up having to go to Retroland together, where they spend the entire time arguing. Some could argue this episode got points it didn't really deserve for an outside reference, but sorry, it's about my favorite episodes. I Dream of Jimmy. Okay, this one is winning for the funniest episode of probably the entire season. It's the one I routinely remember for funny Jimmy Neutron moments, and there's a good reason why. A good portion of this episode takes place in Carl's dream, and therefore dream logic can be used. Or should I say no logic at all. Carl can pull his brain out because why not? Or Sheen can take Carl's brain, remove the glasses, and then wave the brain around like he's using it to talk. Miss Fowl becomes an actual bird, sort of, and so on. Honestly, this whole episode is hilarious, especially because the conflict of this episode is vanquishing Carl's fear of a harmonica-playing lima bean. Also, in order to escape the dream, Jimmy had to kiss Cindy, which Carl says would never happen. Oh boy, how do we tell him? Overall, a really good episode, and one of my favorites. Trading Faces. Now speaking of Jimmy and Cindy, this is your typical switching bodies episode. Honestly, I'm sort of mixed on this trope in general, as it largely depends on how well it's done. So why is this up there with my favorites? Because Jimmy and Cindy are two rivals who spend a bunch of the episode purposefully sniping at one another simply for the sake of it. That's the main draw of this episode for me, as it sort of modifies the existing switching bodies concept. Normally you get the panicked moments or the confusion, and there's a bit of that, but they pretty quickly switch to an entirely new dimension to their rivalry. The ending portion is fine, and actually has some funny moments, but I think the middle is the best, and what really carried this episode. Phantom of Retroland. In this episode, there's a story of a Phantom of Retroland, which Jimmy seeks to disprove, so he decides to break into Retroland with Carl and Sheen to prove that there isn't a Phantom, only to realize that there is one! Sort of. I honestly liked some of the scenes and creative methods surrounding the interactions with the Phantom, until of course we realize it's Nick trying to scare them. But then there's a real Phantom. Oh wait, it's another fake out. Okay, we actually get multiple fake outs, which I actually found quite funny. Until we realized that, I guess there really was a Phantom. Yeah, those multiple fake outs really sold this episode for me. I just think that trope was done well here, along with the rest of the episode. Make room for Daddy-O. Okay, now this episode stands in a category of its own. For starters, this is a very solid Hugh episode, which also expands on his character, so there's definitely bonus points there. Jimmy wants to stop his dad from doing a performance for Father's Day that he fears will cause him to be embarrassed, so he decides to change his dad's entire personality. And cool Hugh is, well, really cool. However, Hugh starts acting poorly or treating people like Jimmy in an uncaring manner, not showing up for dinner, and generally not being there at all. So Jimmy tries undoing this by faking a fall, but this fails and ends with Hugh actually saving Jimmy from a real fall, causing Hugh to snap out of it. Again, it's just a really good character episode, particularly because it shows just how much Hugh really does care about Jimmy, and how Jimmy should care about his dad. Probably the best episode of the entire season right here. I'm also going to give an honorable mention to Sorry Wrong Era, mainly because while I think the plot with Jimmy, Carl, and Sheen was decent enough, the plot with Hugh was hilarious. This episode involves Jimmy inventing a device which allows him to control time at whatever he points it at, but Hugh sends them back into the Cretaceous era, where Jimmy has to find a way back to the present. Again, this plot is just fine, but what matters is the fact that Hugh now has the ability to run around with Jimmy's invention and mess around across town, doing such things as eating the same ice cream over and over again, skydiving without a parachute, but also being brought home by an angry mob, apparently not for the first time, for disgusting Sam's customers, giving Cindy and Libby brain freezes, and apparently making a woman, now quoting, experience the miracle of childbirth again and again and again. Okay, that last one is just evil. This episode is really good for the Hugh portion, though the Jimmy portion also has some decent moments. Alright, now it's time for the worst episodes of Season 1. Brobot. Okay, this one is simple. Jimmy wants a younger brother, but since his parents don't want to make one, Jimmy decides to build one. But Brobot gets very annoying very quickly. And Jimmy tries shutting down Brobot in what's supposed to be a tear-jerking moment, and okay, sorry, can I just say, screw Brobot? I've never felt even slightly sad about Brobot because I've always found Brobot to be obnoxious. So Jimmy instead builds Brobot some parents of his own and sends all of them off to the moon, which is honestly too nice. They should be blasted on a direct course towards the sun. Oh, who am I kidding? Brobot would manage to Deus Ex Machina his way out of destruction somehow. Could you tell I'm really not a fan of this episode? Or Brobot in general for that matter? Granny Baby. Alright, so in this episode, Jimmy makes a solution to make his grandma younger, but this accidentally turns her into a baby. And the joke is that he needs to take care of her. Yeah, that's basically it. Of course we get this obvious joke. And otherwise, the goal of the whole episode was to make sure that Jimmy resolves the issue before his parents get home. Yeah, that's about it. This trope seriously could have been done far better. I mean, for crying out loud, revert her to something like Jimmy's age or a young adult or something, realizing that she can run around to do what she wants again, and force Jimmy to chase her around town. But nope, I guess we needed the worst execution of this trope instead. My Son the Hamster. Weird. Another episode I dislike where it's just An invention transforms a character. Okay, the whole joke of this episode is that Jimmy got turned into a hamster. I will say that a subplot with Hugh is actually pretty decent, so I guess this isn't the worst episode ever. But overall, I just find this episode boring whenever I rewatch it. Party at Neutron's. Okay, you've already heard this before, to a point where I could probably copy and paste what I said from my Mr. Meaty review with an episode that did a similar bit to this one. It's a typical party while the parents aren't home thing, except oh no, the parents are coming back early, and everyone's trashed the place. Mind you, I think that the way it was handled in this episode was certainly better and a bit wackier than I normally see it, and there was a dinosaur in here, but I've just never cared for this type of episode in general. So, as for this season in general, I thought it was really good, and there were only a couple of episodes I really didn't like. Meanwhile, there were so many good episodes that it pained me to have to limit the list of good episodes so much, but I also knew that if I didn't, we'd be here all day. I think Season 1 did have a couple of rough spots, but it was overall pretty good. In fact, there was even a special episode already in Season 1, which we should probably talk about, that being The Eggpire Strikes Back. While this episode, or I guess technically series of episodes, didn't make it onto the worst list, it's certainly not my favorite. So the Yokians return to Earth, but instead of trying to abduct people, they instead win the town over with gifts. Jimmy keeps telling the entire town that it's a trick, pointing out that the Yokians are going to try and revive Poltra there on Earth, but everyone mocks Jimmy for it. Until of course Jimmy turns out to be right. The special isn't completely devoid of good moments, such as this one scene where Carl cracks under pressure from Cindy to tell how Jimmy gets into his lab, but honestly the whole special being one long bit of Jimmy's wrong and gets made fun of, except oops, he was actually right, was rather irritating to watch for 2/3 of the special. I at least get that sort of treatment towards Jimmy when it's his fault, but in this case he was warning the town the entire time and just no one listened. I thought that the final portion of the special was actually pretty decent, and the Yokians themselves were also good to see again, but otherwise the special was simply obnoxious. Well, that does it for Season 1. Again, a mostly good season, but with a few rough patches in there. Now it's time to move on to Season 2. Season 2 is basically Season 1, but if they removed whatever limiter there was on the random and insane moments from Season 1. If Jimmy Neutron ever feels almost like a fever dream, that trend really picked up in Seasons 2 and 3. Alright, let's start off with the best episodes of Season 2. Nightmare in Retroville. Well, since I've been working on this video for quite a while now, and I'm going to end up releasing this in October, we might as well have a Halloween special in here. I actually really like this Halloween episode for a variety of reasons, such as enjoying the nighttime and Halloween setting in general. I get that other episodes have had night settings, but just seeing this much of Retroville like that is really nice. But more importantly, I like how they managed to balance a more scary episode with the show's typical humor and outlandish plots. And okay, scary may not be quite accurate. Perhaps more eerie? In fact, I'll say that for the series in general, I can't think of an episode that really scared me, well, ever now that I think about it. I know there are plenty of shows that have scary episodes, but Jimmy Neutron isn't really one of them. Go watch Courage the Cowardly Dog if you want some scary episodes. There's plenty of that there. Oh, right, I should probably get to the actual plot of the episode already. Carl and Sheen want to do something unique for their costumes this Halloween, so Jimmy decides to turn them into real monsters. However, this turns them into, well, real monsters, so Carl becomes an actual vampire, and Sheen becomes an actual werewolf. Hugh also turns himself into Frankenstein's monster by complete accident, though his subplot is more funny than anything else. Also, just look at Hugh after he picks up Judy here. Sam was also in this episode for a bit, and his interaction with Hugh was also quite funny. I just think that this episode strikes quite a good balance between its more eerie Halloween episode moments and its funny moments. Monster Hunt. This episode is quite the simple one, but also quite clever in how it's done. There's a monster in the Retroville lake, but Jimmy wants to prove that there's no lake monster, opting to charter a boat so that they can find the monster, but Captain Betty destroys a bunch of Jimmy's equipment for some reason. Then the monster attacks in a scene that looks like this, and Okay, look, it's one big Jaws reference of an episode. No complaints here, of course, I just think it's a generally well done episode. Also, the monster turned out to be Carl's pet turtle that had been mutated by Hugh dumping chemicals into the water. Alright, I just wanted an excuse to talk about the Hugh scene because it was hilarious since he just sort of appeared out of nowhere. Return of the Nanobots. So I realized when putting in this entry that I didn't mention the Nanobots beforehand, so I guess that means I should now. The Nanobots are these characters who look like Peabody and Atlas from Portal 2. Or maybe I should say that Peabody and Atlas look like them. Well, in any case, they were originally made to help Jimmy out and prevent him from being bullied, but this quickly backfired, and they were thus put away. However, these two managed to escape after Jimmy tries some upgrades for them, but then gets stuck on the command of correcting for error. After going around the school supposedly correcting everything they can, Jimmy tries to hit them with a paradox. This doesn't work, either because the nanobots have Wheatley level intelligence, or they simply don't care. But they instead decide that because all humans have errors, they should go delete all humans instead. And they somehow managed to do this rather quickly. But not just the school or even Retroville, but seemingly the whole planet. Eventually, Jimmy has to save the day by making the nanobots accidentally list out all of pi. Or as much as they can, rather. Also, there's a great Hugh subplot in here, where he managed to avoid the nanobots somehow, so he thinks he's the only person left on Earth, and spends a bunch of time doing crazy things, and also gets a bunch of free pie in the process. I seriously like this episode since it's just so well done, and basically all of the jokes land. Out Darn Spotlight. Now this is an episode I used to think was just okay, but now I actually really like later on. But I guess I should explain why I used to dislike it. It's one of these episodes where Betty shows up and Jimmy's brain ceases to function whenever she's nearby. Oh, right, I guess I should explain who Betty is. She's basically Jimmy's sort of love interest for a while there, but she seems to only be nice to Jimmy instead of actually reciprocating. She doesn't appear all that much, and it's usually the same bit with Jimmy whenever she's around. I honestly still don't like these portions of the episode, but the rest of the episode is actually really great. For crying out loud, the first half of this episode is almost non-stop jokes, and basically every single one lands. This episode is genuinely hilarious throughout, and hey, the Mechabeth in space part isn't half bad either. I think my only other gripe with this episode is that the ending conflict with a tornado that reaches to space, sure, was a bit sudden. Otherwise, this is by far one of my favorite episodes of the season, maybe even of the series. I'll also give it an honorable mention to Men at Work. Or should I say dishonorable mention, because for some reason the McSpanky security system takes control of the restaurant and begins flying around destroying Retroville. Oh, wait a second, this isn't my script. Okay, all jokes aside though, while before I used to think it was a pretty good episode, now I think it's just decent. I think that the changes Jimmy made to the restaurant were a bit much, even just in terms of design, and I have no clue why he thought giving the restaurant the ability to fly and melt other restaurants was a good idea. And I mean, seriously, it's been said before, but not everyone could have made it out in time.
Someone could have been taking a shit in there and just fucking died.
Also, there's this very brief subplot with Zix, Travolton, and T looking for a new spaceship, but the problem is it's just slapped into the middle of the episode out of nowhere. It's worse because it could have easily been placed towards the very end of the episode with no issues, so I don't get why it's here. In fact, it kind of spoils the ending of the episode. Alright, now it's time for the worst episodes. Before we begin though, I think save for maybe one episode, I don't think any of these episodes are actually really bad. More just less good. The Retroville 9. Okay, this is the episode where I believe a bunch of people in Retroville are insane. This involves Jimmy creating performance-enhancing bats and gloves to win at baseball games. And by performance-enhancing, I mean they'll cause players to float around to catch balls and automatically hit pitches. This causes the team to think that they're really good at baseball somehow, even though the equipment literally glows every time it's active. Seriously, sometimes I wonder if the people of Retroville are about as smart as those in Two Fort, and they just drink water with a bunch of lead in it. How did they not notice the glowing gloves and baseball bats earlier? Then again, there is one episode that acknowledges that asbestos removal is still a big deal, which implies that lead in the pipes isn't exactly an impossible thing. Also, this is one of those episodes where the conflict can be seen coming from a mile away, and I'm never really fond of those types of episodes. In short, the conflict is that the players think they're better than they really are, and Jimmy doesn't correct them until it's too late, and they lose horribly to a Japanese team. Yeah, one of the weaker episodes of this season for sure. I don't like seeing the conflict coming from a mile away like a train barreling down the tracks. Love Potion 976-J. Alright, time for a Valentine's Day special. Oh boy. Jimmy creates a love potion, it accidentally leaks and causes him to fall in love with Cindy, but then, he finds out what happened. Again, it's one of those plots where the conflict can be seen coming from far away, and it's one of those not even remotely subtle Jimmy and Cindy episodes. I guess it could be worse, since at least the jokes still generally land in here, but this episode isn't all that great if you ask me. The Feud. Now, the first two bad episodes in here are just sort of ones I don't care for. But this is one that I actively dislike, with a few caveats, of course. Basically, the Neutrons and the Weezers, or rather the parents of both families, get into fights and so forbid Carl and Jimmy from seeing one another. And the arguments are rather stupid. I get that's part of the joke, but I've never been fond of this episode regardless. I think Sheen managed to carry this episode from a truly bad episode to something that's just annoying to me, since at least Sheen was actually really funny in here, such as literally just appearing crammed inside Jimmy's cabinet. And now on to the specials. Season 2 has not one, but two specials, one of which being over 40 minutes, and the other being well over an hour. So to start off, we have Rescue Jet Fusion. In this special, we're introduced to Jet Fusion, an actor who plays a spy, but is also actually a spy. He works for the BTSO, or Big Top Secret Organization, who requests Jimmy's help in finding him. Jimmy brings along Carl and Sheen on this big adventure, even though Carl isn't very good at the whole not telling people they're spies part, and also his singing is terrible. Jimmy eventually ends up captured, and we find out that this is all the work of Professor Calamitous. I told you he was a recurring villain, who has a plan to melt all the snow on Mount Everest, causing sea levels to rise. I still don't get how this is much of a concern though, since even that much snow shouldn't cause global sea levels to rise by that much. Catastrophic local flooding, sure, but well, okay, this is the villain who can never finish anything, to be fair. Oh, also, he somehow has a daughter who is helping him with his evil plans, named Beautiful Gorgeous. Well, I guess we can say that Professor Calamitous at least managed to finish something. Anyway, Jimmy and Jet Fusion foil Calamitous' plans by working together, and that's basically the entire special. I think the special is decent enough. Ironically, I think it's one of the weaker parts of the season, mainly because of its slower pace, which means the jokes and plot points it does have are spread out much further. The good the special does have ends up being quite good, but at times I feel like it starts to get close to being filler. Not quite there, but close. And the other special for this season is Win, Lose, Kaboom, which is over an hour long. I mean, seriously, this borders on a second movie at a certain point. Jimmy manages to decipher the text engraved on a rock which came from outer space, thinking that he would discover some special knowledge. However, this was actually an invite to a game show. Apparently, it would have been better for them to have destroyed this rock, because as it turns out, now that they're in the game show, losing or forfeiting also means destruction of Earth. A game show where the characters are forced to play? Nah, sorry guys, I've already hit my Deltarune limit for the video. Although our good host here reminds me of MC Ballyhoo from Mario Party 8, who in turn reminds me of DJ Halliboo, which means too bad you're getting a Mario Party DS anti-piracy reference instead. This game show involves a few challenges that those from each planet have to play, which Jimmy and his friends are all initially terrible at. However, by skill and simple dumb luck, they manage to win. Of note is that during this entire time, the parents back on Earth are trying to find a way to break into the game show. This also includes Hugh watching the now available intergalactic cable, which becomes important as not only does he literally stumble his way into the game show, but he's able to use what he watched on intergalactic cable to help everyone from Earth win. They leave, but realize they need to save everyone else, whose own planets are about to be destroyed, and manage to do so successfully. Now that's a very, very brief overview of an hour-long special, one which is quite good in my opinion and should be watched. Each event has its own special twist to it, but I'm going to briefly discuss my favorite event in here, that being this race against a bunch of what are essentially brains that move very slowly. During this, the characters manage to win and make it back to Earth, but oops, this isn't Earth at all, but rather a trick by the brains into thinking they had gone through a shortcut and won the game. So not only do the characters have to get through this bizarre version of Retroville, which I thought was a really good portion to begin with, but they're also on what's basically a timer to get back to the real game, and win the race for real. And they actually cut this super close. Seriously, this was probably my favorite part of the special, though most of the rest of it was also quite good. And that's Season 2! Quite a good season where you can really tell they upped just how insane the episodes could be, and that's saying something given the fact that Season 1 was weird enough as is. There's only one episode I could think of in this season that I actually didn't like, with the rest ranging from decent to actually really good and super funny. Things in Season 2 are more bizarre than ever, and don't need any real reason to happen, instead just happening for the sake of it. Having a random beach party in the middle of the desert. Sure, why not? Nanobots deleting the entire human population somehow. That's fine too. Sheen growing a giant head and using it to zap people. Why not? And for this show, it actually works quite well. But enough about all of that, as it's time for Season 3. If Season 2 didn't care about how insane it could get, then oh, just imagine how Season 3 is going to be. Starting off with the best of Season 3, we have the N-Men. Hey, I wonder what the N stands for. All of that aside though, this episode is quite good in my opinion. This involves Jimmy and the others all getting superpowers, Cindy can fly and has super strength, Sheen can run super fast, Libby can turn invisible, and Carl has extremely strong burps. Meanwhile, Jimmy, well, initially he can only turn somewhat orange, but eventually we find out he can turn into the bootleg Incredible Hulk. Do we also get the scene where the creators realized they hadn't used up all their stock footage yet? I really do like this episode though, both for how creative it was, and how funny its jokes can be. Also, the memes have certainly helped that somewhat.
Hey, I was invisible! Cool!
I don't feel so good.
Fundemonium. This episode is also a really good one, mainly for just how off the rails it goes in such a short time. Jimmy's family is going to have to move unless Hugh can manage to successfully get a job as a toy inventor. And he also has to invent a new toy every single day. But since Hugh isn't exactly very good at that, Jimmy has to fix everything for him and enhance it. One of these times, Jimmy ends up falling asleep, and Hugh has to find batteries on his own, but instead decides to grab Peabody and Atlas. Oh, wait, sorry, I mean the nanobots. They of course cause chaos by causing the toys to grow giant and out of control, and then rampage through the city. Yeah, once the conflict truly kicks off, things go fast. Seriously, just having this weird hybrid toy destroying everything in this city is really funny, and this is just a really good episode in my opinion. And while Hugh does get fired from his toy invention job for some reason, he does get hired back at his old job because of how much destruction the toy caused. Who's your mommy? So this is the Alien Mpreg episode. No, that isn't even a bit or an exaggeration, that's literally what this episode is. Carl gets attacked by an alien, and while everything initially seems fine, he ends up becoming... Okay, I'm not sure if you can call it pregnant exactly, but that's what we're rolling with an energy being, and... You know what? Trying to explain what the hell this episode even is fails to do it any good. Just watch the episode yourself, since it's one of, if not possibly the most bizarre of the entire series. Because seriously, without context, what on earth is even going on here? And before I continue, this episode also has this great scene with Hugh refusing to pay an outrageous electricity bill, and then...
Ooh, I didn't know you were so strapped for cash. Will you take a check?
Vanishing act. And in this episode, we have more of Jimmy's brain leaking out of his ears when he sees Betty. But wait a second, I thought I didn't like that, right? While true, this episode acts to finally resolve that. But we'll get to that portion in just a minute. This episode involves Jimmy trying to do a magic show for Betty, but Cindy messes with Jimmy's invention and creates a dimensional doorway. The goal for the rest of the episode is everyone trying to get back. I really enjoy the amount of locations they go to in this episode, as well as some of the visual effects. And I enjoy how much they got out of the synth in here. Sorry, I just really like synth music. And finally, they resolved this whole Betty situation, with that being Betty pulling Cindy aside after an argument, with Betty saying she isn't really interested in Jimmy, and that he's all for Cindy. Good. Glad we can finally strike that dumb recurring bit off of the list for Jimmy. I really enjoyed this episode, especially since it's another one of those off-the-wall episodes where they could do pretty much whatever. Okay, time for the worst episodes. And sadly, this season does have a couple of episodes that I genuinely don't like. Clash of the Cousins. Okay, so do you remember back in the Season 1 special, The Eggpire Strikes Back? It was one giant case of, no one believes Jimmy until near the very end. Well, shorten that to 11 minutes, and you have this episode. This episode involves the character of Baby Eddie, who is actually an evil genius who wants a bunch of inheritance money, and continually makes Jimmy look bad to get him and the other relatives out of the picture. Jimmy finally proves at the very end that Baby Eddie is evil, and that's about it. Yeah, not a very great episode if you ask me. Also, just as an aside, this somehow feels like a very Season 1 episode, despite it being in Season 3, and I don't know why. Maybe that's just me though. Carl Wheezer, boy genius. And this is just one giant episode of Carl trying to impress a girl he met from Sweden by treating Jimmy and Sheen poorly the entire time. With Sheen trying to make Jimmy go along for the bit to make Carl look better, until Jimmy finally can't stand it any longer. I think this episode concept actually could have worked even fairly well, but Carl continually being a jerk the entire time wasn't all that funny after more than a couple of times. Instead, it just became annoying really quickly. It's sort of like the SpongeBob episode I'm Was Stupid, which is actually one of my least favorite classic SpongeBob episodes for a very similar reason. Alright, and now we have two specials, those being Attack of the Twonkies and the League of Villains, both clocking in at about 40 minutes each. In Attack of the Twonkies, Jimmy goes to a comet, only to realize there's a monster there, which he just barely manages to escape. Meanwhile, Carl is looking for a new pet, and Sheen tries out for the school choir, and fails in hilarious fashion. A creature from the comet has apparently managed to make it back to Earth with Jimmy, and since Carl isn't allergic to these creatures, he wants it as a pet. After Jimmy reluctantly agrees, Carl shows this creature in class, which he's named as a Twonky. But it ends up spawning more Twonkies while there, which causes everyone to get their own Twonky. However, as it turns out, Twonkies evolve into monsters when they hear music, so the latter half of the special involves Jimmy rounding all of them up to send back to space. However, he accidentally creates a giant Twonky when he leaves the creatures near music, and we also find out during the special that because Sheen has such a terrible voice, it actually harms the Twonkies. Also, there's a subplot with Hugh and this wooden dummy he bought, which gets used as fuel at the end of the episode, in part because Judy hates it, because seriously, check out this look she gets when she realizes she can finally destroy it. Overall, a pretty decent special, and a lot of the jokes in this special were actually really good. Oh, and I like this band they had, but also not the most amazing special ever. It's decent enough though. And for the final special, we have the League of Villains. This special involves all of Jimmy's old foes getting together in a plot to destroy him. Also, this should be noted right away, but this is the final episode, sort of. You see, this is another dinosaur situation, where the final episode, at least in what's supposed to be the series order, was released, and then a bunch of other episodes were included afterwards, much like how in Dinosaurs, Changing Nature was released only to have episodes afterwards, even though that makes no sense in terms of that series. For Jimmy Neutron, this explains why there are a couple of characters, like this Granny character and Baby Eddie, who we hadn't even seen up to that point, that were suddenly Jimmy's enemies. They literally show up in later episodes of this season, so I'm considering this the finale. In general though, I really liked this special. Well, mostly. I thought most of the jokes landed, and the plot was pretty solid. I also liked T's character development here, though that might also be in part because I like T's character in general, because he's really funny. Basically, every character had a funny moment in here, and I enjoyed the special a lot because of that. I think my only real gripe is that at the very end of the special, which is basically the finale of the series, we end on this type of joke again. Still a mostly great finale though. And that concludes some of my favorites and least favorites of each season. Now granted, there are a lot of mainly good episodes I skipped over, and it's a shame because I want to talk about a lot of these episodes, but I also know that we'd be here all day if I'd tried. A lot of these contenders for best episodes were super close, but we have to move on at some point. So who here remembers Fairly Odd Parents? You know, that one series that's good up through season 4 and then most people pretend the rest doesn't exist. Though honestly, I wasn't ever the biggest fan of the show. In a tier list of shows I'd watch, Fairly Odd Parents was firmly in the if shows I preferred weren't on tier. I'll be fair, it's a perfectly fine show, but it isn't part of my absolute favorites. I don't know, maybe I'll rewatch some more and see if that changes. But sorry, I'm going on a tangent. If anyone has watched Jimmy Neutron, you're likely aware of the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour specials. Well, okay, hour might be a bit of a stretch. Basically, this is a crossover episode between the two shows, which also means you need at least a basic understanding of both. Fine, let me go brush up on my Fairly Odd Parents knowledge. So, the Jimmy Timmy episodes. My feelings are even now still a bit mixed on these. I've never been able to fully decide whether I like the original or the sequel the best. And yes, I'm aware I didn't mention a third one, but oh, we'll get to that. Let's start off with the first special though. For the original Power Hour special, Timmy shows up in the greatest lab in the universe. Even though the specials later go on to state that this is actually another universe, but just roll with it. With this lab being Jimmy's? Because no one else in Jimmy's universe somehow has a better lab than him. That aside, Timmy wishes himself there, and meanwhile Jimmy is working on performing an upgrade on Goddard. Timmy messes with a bunch of Jimmy's things, meanwhile Jimmy somehow doesn't notice this for a while, until eventually accidentally using Timmy's auto pooper, which warps Jimmy to Dimsdale. The conflict of both episodes truly arises when Timmy turns Goddard evil when he installs a video game. Wait a second, where did the other disc go? Meanwhile, Crocker finds out that fairies are real, and uses Jimmy's attempt at using the auto pooper to send him home to instead take Crocker to Fairy World so that he can take over. I'll be honest, I sort of prefer the conflict with Jimmy better. Sure, Timmy's is decent enough, especially since because Cosmo and Wanda aren't there, he can't just wish the problem out of existence. But Timmy also has himself and others helping him, while Jimmy has to take back Fairy World almost entirely on his own. I thought this special was still a really neat crossover, even though one portion outshined the other. Also, let's talk about the different designs here real quick. Jimmy and Timmy seem to have been translated decently enough to the other worlds, though Timmy always still looks a little bit off. Not horribly so, but you can sort of tell he isn't supposed to be there. Alright, up next we have the sequel. Power Hour 2 honestly starts out rough, but quickly improves. The first bit of the special is basically a bunch of Jimmy and Timmy fighting over Cindy, both wanting to ask her to their own respective Friday the 13th dance. This goes on a bit longer than I'd like, but it isn't awful either. We get another two conflicts, that being Professor Calamitous seeing Cosmo and Wanda, and then Professor Calamitous managing to get into Timmy's universe to find a collaborator of his own. Meanwhile, the anti-fairies can't escape on Friday the 13th, but have been made visible to others, which means Calamitous happens upon Anti-Cosmo, and he helps free the anti-fairies. And then Anti-Cosmo almost immediately betrays Calamitous. Jimmy and Timmy have to help get all of the anti-fairies, and just as they're done with that, Timmy fuses Calamitous and Jorgen, because he's an idiot, and Calamitous uses his new power to take over Retroville, and also try to cause a second Big Bang. I'm surprised he managed to come up with that plan though, and fulfill it to near completion actually. In order to save the day, Timmy realizes that they have to break as many of the rules as they can, which eventually helps to set Jorgen free, who manages to fix everything. And that's the second Power Hour special. Now, I will say that this special was a lot more even in its conflicts. Jimmy and Timmy both worked together on the conflicts, unlike the first one where Jimmy's conflict was the interesting one, while the other just sort of existed. I think Power Hour 2 is currently my favorite, mainly because it felt a lot more balanced. It isn't absolutely perfect, but it's pretty good for what it is. Oh right, this is also where we get Carl's very interesting wish from.
Hi, Mrs. Neutron.
Oh no. And speaking of Carl, I will say that one gripe I do have is with some of the character designs in this special. Most everyone turned out fine, Professor Calamitous looks a little weird, but Sheen and Carl have always looked off in their Fairly OddParents style, and it still bothers me. Okay, and finally on to the third one. Let's just get this one over with. I really don't like this third Jimmy Timmy special. And this isn't something where it's still okay, just not as good as the previous ones. No, this one just isn't good. I think part of this is that it suffers a bit from the later Fairly OddParents writing style from what I can tell, so the quality sort of suffered there. In fact, I'll say this even for the first two specials. It felt like in terms of writing, the Fairly OddParents aspects of writing took more precedence, and I'm not sure how to feel about that as someone who's a bigger fan of the Jimmy Neutron writing aspects. It wasn't too bad, and certainly not entirely one-sided, well, until now of course. In this third special, the writing leans heavily towards the Fairly OddParents aspects. The new ones, no less. Basically, this is Jimmy and Timmy trying to create one of the toughest villains they could think of, after they defeated the enemies they could currently think of, such as Eustace Stritch or the Negachin. However, this special leans so heavily to one side in its writing, and even where it takes place. A large portion of this special is in 2D, with a few portions in 3D. Oh, also, can I just say I really don't like how Chester and AJ look in 3D? If Timmy looked a bit out of place, then these two look really out of place. Oh, and don't get me started on the new villain that they created, named Shirley, who looks really weird in 3D. Maybe that's why they had most of it take place in 2D. Also, there's a subplot about Jimmy and Timmy not caring about their friends for a while, the enemy they created takes over and puts everyone in... Oh, hey, a Super Paper Mario reference. I didn't realize Shirley created that one Void level, and the resolution to the special was really underwhelming, with them just having to trick Shirley into downgrading all of his powers. Okay, can you tell I really don't like this special? In fact, even if I put this up against the rest of the Jimmy Neutron episodes, this would be one of the weakest ones. It isn't exciting or interesting, it's just boring. Say what you will for specials like the Eggpire Strikes Back, but at least something interesting happened near the end. Or even episodes like The Feud, at least it was short. I feel like this special was made because, well, we need a third one, and nothing more. So in short, the first two are pretty good, and I think the sequel is a bit better than the first, and the third one isn't all that good.
This guy stinks!
Now, unlike shows like Dinosaurs, which had no games at all, or Mr. Meaty, which only had a few Flash games, Jimmy Neutron not only had multiple games of his own, but starred in others. Right now we're only going to talk about the Jimmy Neutron specific games. Luckily there are only a few full retail games, and for Flash games there are... Oh no! Let's start out with the Jimmy Neutron game based on the movie. Oh wait, there are multiple different versions of this. Okay, let's try the PC version first. Okay, so after trying this for a little bit, I've been fighting and trying to get this game to work for a while. Unfortunately, the controls for this game are sort of awful. In fact, let's just read the controls for a moment. Up and down move you forwards and backwards, while left and right turn you like a tank. Enter and control are primary fire, and shift and insert are the jump button. But wait, don't worry, there are other controls for this. Because, hey, if you want to move forward with your mouse, you can do that too, by literally moving your mouse forward. So I'm not sure there's a ton I can do about the mouse, but I decided I had to rebind these keyboard controls if nothing else, which meant I had to use a third-party application for this. And okay, you know what? It's time for a rant. This game was made in 2001, without the option to rebind any of the keys or controls whatsoever. It was made after Doom, Quake, and Half-Life. I don't get who thought this awful tank control scheme was a good idea, but the fact that you can't even attempt to change the controls without additional software is really annoying. But, for the sake of completion, I'll try playing this game with the terrible controls. So alright, let's begin with this PC version of the game. To spoil this, the PC version is vastly different from the console versions. I finally got the controls to something somewhat tolerable by forcibly rebinding the keys, but even with that, like I said, I can't fix certain things like the mouse. And since moving forward is something as simple as moving the mouse forward, trying to move the mouse to turn results in this being registered as inconsistent forward movement. So suddenly I'm moving forward because I dared to try using the mouse to turn. So fine, no mouse. But oh, operating this with solely keyboard controls isn't much better. And this whole issue really cripples the gameplay, and we'll be getting back to that in a moment. There are other things that should be mentioned, however. Luckily for each important item we get a tutorial where Vox talks very slowly.
To use your shrink ray, point toward the object you wish to shrink. Then press and hold the left mouse button.
It's also a great place to show off just how awful the controls can be sometimes. Let's take this jetpack section as an example. So the jetpack should just make you go up or maybe forward, right? Well, not quite, as it depends on the terrain beneath you. So if you start on this platform, you can't just immediately go flying over to the next one. Since there's no platform beneath you, the literally nothing will start aggressively dragging you back down, causing you to lose any upward momentum you had gotten. That basically means you have to act as if there's a sort of warm-up period on the jetpack. The one upside to the jetpack is this glitch I found where if you use the jetpack just as you're above a character, you can go rocketing into the sky. It's basically useless from what I can tell, but it's at least entertaining. Also, let's talk about the frame rate for a moment. This isn't a problem with the recording or anything. Now, I played this using the hardware accelerated executable, but for all I know, the software mode would have been better somehow. Needless to say though, this is the frame rate that the game runs at. Sometimes the frame rate is fine, other times it's super slow, and I have no clue why. I also found what I can only assume is an Easter egg on the TV. What on earth is going on here? Is the TV possessed, or is this a broadcast hijacking or something? For some reason it looks a bit unnerving, though maybe it's because I'm seeing glowing eyes in here. But let's discuss other things for a bit, such as the missions in the game, the music, the graphics, and so on. This game seems to largely consist of a bunch of smaller missions. Go here to give Carl something. Go over here to give Sheen something. Go talk to Libby. Then go talk to Cindy. Also, let's take a look at these characters briefly. They're, off. Some of them admittedly look mostly fine. Like Jimmy, who looks mostly fine except for the squirrel look. Libby and Sheen also seem to have made it relatively unscathed. But then there's characters like Carl and Cindy. Carl, especially front-facing, looks bad in a funny sort of way because he's literally just a triangle. And Cindy? Oh wow, okay, Cindy just looks uncanny and almost nightmarish. It looks like they tried to give her a more realistic face compared to everyone else, but then forgot that it was 2001 and they couldn't do that in games yet. Between that and things like the fact that she doesn't ever fully blink, it all looks unnerving. Sure, you could argue that for some of the other characters, but it's especially noticeable on Cindy. Next, the music, which honestly isn't anything to write home about. It's nothing awful, but not the most interesting thing ever. I'm just going to use my own music during these sections. But hey, I haven't complained about the gameplay for a bit, have I? Well, during one of the training areas, I nearly gave up trying to deal with this grappling hook. Now, okay, maybe I'm just spoiled from later games, but this doesn't instantly latch you onto a surface at a set distance each time. Instead, this attaches to a surface and gradually pulls you forward and up. This would be fine except for one small problem. If there are lots of platforms in the way, it becomes a complete nightmare. Getting stuck under platforms, the grappling hook trying to latch through platforms, or even the grappling hook causing you to phase through platforms. And this isn't helped by the fact that the grappling hook is a nightmare to aim. If only I had something like, I don't know, some actual mouse look. Okay though, it's fine. I managed to make it through that training mission, so I didn't give up there. No, instead I gave up on this mission, where I have to get plutonium from the power plant and stop a meltdown. The problem here is that I'm on a timer, so I'm fighting these awful controls all while on a timer, not knowing what to do for certain things such as these cooling fans, and oh yeah, did I ever mention that certain abilities take energy, which is also shared with your health? Look, if this game had better controls, I would consider continuing the game, but as it stands I just can't. It's just too much jank for one game. This feels like a Slav jank game, except it wasn't made by Slavs. Or at least I don't think it was. Next there's the PS2 and GameCube versions, which as far as I can tell are very similar if not identical, so I'll stick with the GameCube version for now. This version is definitely an improvement, though there are a few things to note. First of all, many of the models in this game look off. While the first game had some uncanny models, these models feel off in a different sort of way. Jimmy can never shut his mouth for some reason, Carl looks a bit too much like a squirrel and also can't shut his mouth, Sheen looks flat out unnerving, Nick looks like he's high or something, Cindy probably fared the best, but that isn't saying much. Oh, except Goddard. Goddard actually looks pretty decent in this game, all things considered. There's also a couple of gameplay issues, but they're relatively small things, like the run not being very fast, and how Jimmy probably could have benefited from a double jump. So, okay, a pretty decent game, right? Well, yes, but there's one major problem. One horrible problem that breaks this entire game for me. The camera is abysmal. You have literally no control over the camera at all. The big issue with this mainly revolves around platforming, and how I sometimes want to make a jump, but I'm not certain as to whether the jump is even possible, and I can't adjust the camera at all to check. The camera does whatever it wants, and while I guess that's good for making sure it doesn't glitch, it ruins what would otherwise be a decent enough gameplay experience. So where it works, the gameplay is passable, arguably even decent. But where it doesn't, everything feels cramped, difficult to control, and like a complete guessing game. Sorry, I had to drop this one. I think with a free camera, or even some degree of camera control, I could play this, but as it stands, I just can't. And finally, we have the GBA version. Okay, so this is going to be the weakest of the bunch, right? Well, actually, no. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that in terms of playability, this one is probably the best. I think the real issue is that it's just a tedious game to play. Also, I've never been able to fully get used to GBA games and just how zoomed in they can be, so I end up getting screwed over by things that I literally can't see until I've already crashed into them. However, the game is ultimately fairly easy as long as you're not trying to rush through things, but at the same time, the tedious nature of things sort of makes one want to, well, rush through things. Oh, and let's talk about the music. Each world has one track which plays throughout the entire thing. So if you're good at the game, you'll probably be hearing the same looping track for 10 to 15 minutes at least. But if you fail on any of these, be prepared to hear this same song over and over and over. It gets a bit monotonous after a while. Oh, right, also the save system is password based, and I never miss those. One other thing I'll add before moving on has to be the graphics. Most of these are fairly decent, but front-facing Jimmy doesn't have enough detail in the eyes, so it looks like his eyes are just a void. Also, Goddard doesn't have anything in the way of an animation while flying, so he just sits there idly and levitates. And those are the games based on the first movie. Needless to say, those were rough. The GBA game was pretty decent for what it was worth, to a point where I nearly finished it. but the other games I just couldn't sit through with their super glaring gameplay issues. I think it would be great if there had been the free roam level designs of the PC game, combined with some actually halfway decent controls. I mean, I'd accept a controller to play the PC game as long as it actually functions somewhat well. The big issue with both the PC and console games had to be the controls, although for different reasons. The console games sort of functioned for the most part, but the camera being locked in like it was made it awful to play. And meanwhile, the PC game was just one long fight against the controls for what looks like it could be a decent game. Oh, right, before we move on though, did you know that Goddard can talk in the PC game?
Goddard, I need to locate a part that only you can get to. Can you help me?
Is it dangerous? Is there a chance I might never be coming back? Tell Mom and Dad I love them. Do your best to bring me home. I'll be back.
What the fuck?
Okay, on to the next games, with this next one being Jimmy Neutron versus versus Jimmy Negatron. This one, oddly enough, was only released on the PC and GBA, so we don't get a proper console port for this one. Let's start with the PC version. Oh no. It's the exact same control scheme as the first game. Literally the exact same. Sorry, I'm not playing this. The controls are just that bad. Though I will say that this happened in the intro cutscene.
Wait up, Cindy. I've got some flurp for you.
Oh, purple flurp?
No, this flurp is new and... Hey, you!
Oh, no you don't. You're just trying to...
No!
Negative.
Okay, let's try the GBA game instead. And, well, it's sort of better. Mind you, it isn't amazing either, mainly due to how the controls work in this sort of top-down perspective, making it a bit difficult to aim and fire the shrink ray, especially with its short range. That's one of my issues with the game. It gets rather hectic at times, and the control scheme isn't sufficient to really compensate for the issues. You get bombarded with enemies that, upon each hit, warp you backwards to a seemingly random area behind you, which gets annoying really fast. Could we not just have invincibility frames like a normal game? So you either have to end up taking each level very slowly, or race through only to get continually warped backwards. It's a shame too, since there seems to be quite a bit of content in this game, but it's ultimately a bit tedious. I'm sure it isn't bad if you have this game and only this game to play, but let's not pretend that it's fantastic either. Oh wait, actually some of the music tracks are pretty decent, like in this alternate dimension where everybody is evil. I don't care for it being the only track playing through every single level in this area, but it's good for a couple of minutes. I've also realized that Jimmy Negatron was basically prototype Evil Jimmy. Yeah, luckily they changed the name before he appeared in the main show, unlike what happened in Fairly Odd Parents. Next up we have Jimmy Neutron Jet Fusion, this time only for consoles and GBA, so no PC version here. I decided to play the Jet Fusion GameCube port, which was all around pretty decent. Can I just begin by saying that this game's intro cutscenes look really glossy? Don't worry, that isn't a complaint or anything. It's just quite different compared to the main series. I can only guess someone messed with the lighting values and gloss, but it feels very 2000s and I really like that. Not only could I get a widescreen hack working, but also a 60 FPS code. And hey, unlike the previous games, this has a more or less free camera system. In this game, Jet Fusion gets abducted by Professor Calamitous after one of Jimmy's inventions goes awry and turns the world into locales based on a Jet Fusion book. You go through various locations such as Japan, a volcano, a shipyard, an underwater area, and New Mexico. and you fight bosses based on certain characters from Retroville, like Sheen, who is the Ultra Ninja Lord, Miss Fowl, who's ruler of the volcano, I think, Cindy, who has turned into the Leviathan, who also has her movie design for some reason, and honestly, I really like these areas. Well, save for one problem. Jimmy's kinda slow in this game, and while I enjoy the large game worlds, I feel like Jimmy should move 50% faster than he actually does. It isn't too terrible, unless of course you miss an item, which can be annoying. The gameplay, while sometimes a bit finicky, is overall fine enough. I think the only time where I thought a portion of this game was really stupid had to be this portion where I had to use Goddard's Play Dead mode to blow up this Ultra Lord spawner, which the game didn't teach all that well. In fact, I wouldn't have even known about it except for the fact that I went into the tutorial room a second time to see if anything had changed. Another issue was this conveyor belt area in a much later level. However, I think that's my fault with the 60 FPS code enabled, because once I disabled that, it was fine. However, I can't say I actually completed this game. Why is that? Well, in this level, somewhere in the desert, you're supposed to set up a satellite dish of some kind. However, despite having all of the parts, the game either has some sort of bug, or I'm just doing something wrong, since I couldn't figure out how to get this working. It worked fine on every single other level, so why not this one? I suppose I could go back through the entire level and make sure I didn't miss anything, with Jimmy's movement speed. Oh, but I did like some bits they did during this game, such as some of the mini-games, like this one, which is pretty clearly a reference to Missile Command. Or hey, this reference was funny too.
I cannot do it, Captain. I get no power.
And the racing mini-games were quite enjoyable. Not the slide puzzle mini-game, because I just don't really like slide puzzles. As for the rest of the game, it's decent, but some of the regular gameplay became monotonous after a while. It's serviceable and arguably a decent game, though it does have some flaws. So the GBA version is also pretty decent. Unlike the previous GBA game, this one isn't in a weird perspective where you get teleported halfway across the level each time you get hit by an enemy. It's a simple platformer, though I suppose you could also argue that it's sort of like a run and gun. The story is very similar to the GameCube version, as we have Jimmy's book report going awry after his invention fails, and turning the town into various locales from the Jet Fusion book. Also, we're finally consistent on the character design, so that's good to see. You run through Japan, a volcano area, and an underwater area, much like the GameCube game, fighting the Ultra Ninja Lord Sheen. Miss Fowl was replaced by Carl in the volcano area for some reason, and Cindy, who reverted back to her movie design again. What the hell? Speaking of the fights, this game is actually quite easy. I know some might say that makes sense since it's a licensed game from the 2000s, but given some of the horrendous control issues I had with the other games, this game controls surprisingly well and is mostly free from jank. The only boss I died to even once was Carl, and that's only because I didn't realize this platform was over here to dodge this giant boulder attack. And even the final boss was a complete joke. And the enemies are more often than not jokes, since you can stun lock most of them just by firing over and over again, so the only time they become a challenge is when there's a lot of them on screen. Now, I do have some complaints, but compared to the control issues of some of the other games, they're relatively insignificant. First of all, you're forced into minigames before you unlock the main boss of the area, with those minigames being Pachinko, a music minigame involving hitting the correct buttons at the right time, and 2 minigames where one has to navigate through tight corridors. I think Pachinko was the most fun for what it was worth, though honestly the Mario 64 DS version is better. The music minigame was boring, and the navigation minigame was simply annoying. One other thing worth mentioning is that during one portion of the game, I was trying to find where to unlock the next invention. Normally when you try to enter an area you've already been to and gotten the part from, Jimmy will stop you. However, for some reason I'm still unaware of, there was one instance where the game didn't stop me from entering a level I had already been to, but it did prevent me from leaving. So if I hadn't kept the password handy, I would have had to replay the entire level. Oh right, also this has a password save system because I guess they couldn't be bothered to put in a proper save battery. But you know what? This game was decent enough that I actually finished it. It isn't incredible or anything, but you know what? This is probably the best one so far. And finally, we have Attack of the Twonkies. One of the few games I've actually heard of, since it's apparently pretty decent, but I guess there's only one way to find out. Let's start out with the console version before moving on to the GBA version. So the GameCube version of this game is actually pretty good, but of course before we get started, let's talk about the story. Okay, this is actually rather similar to the Attack of the Twonkies episode. In fact, it's similar enough that the opening cutscene uses some audio from the episode itself, but reanimated in the game engine. Considering they could have likely just slapped a bit-crushed video of the special's intro in here instead, I appreciate that they went to the effort of reanimating this in the engine. That, or they just ran out of disk space, because for those who don't remember, this was back when videos couldn't be compressed much for games, save for literally lowering the bitrate. That's also why half of the data for the Wind Waker is actually the ending cutscene. Alright, also this is based on a special from Season 3, right? Yeah, so that makes me ask yet again, why is Cindy still using her movie design here? But yeah, the main story of the game is really similar to the special for the first bit. There's a comet headed to Earth that Jimmy decides to go and look at, meanwhile Carl wants to go buy a new pet, and Sheen finds out he's just generally bad at singing. The portion where this game deviates, however, is that while in the special the Twonkies are given to a bunch of people and then they attack, in-game they just immediately start causing chaos as soon as they're discovered. After that, the stories diverge somewhat, with Jimmy being blamed for this whole mess by the teleporting Principal Willoughby, yeah, I don't know either, and having to go around town capturing increasingly tougher Twonkies, ultimately resulting in defeating the final boss. Unlike in the special where they're sent back to the comet, I'm pretty sure the Twonkies are all just killed. Now, as for how fun this game is, I'm still personally weighing whether I prefer this or the Jet Fusion game better. I will say that on the whole, this game is more fun to actually play, mainly because the levels aren't as expansive as the previous one. But wait, wouldn't larger levels be better? Well, yes, in many games that would be the case. But with Jet Fusion, the levels were large, but Jimmy's speed was actually pretty similar to what we have here, which is something I haven't cared for in either game. Jimmy just feels a bit too slow, with basically no way to speed him up except for items you get much later in the game. One which is difficult to control, and the other which doesn't even help much. So if you happen to miss something in the level, or somehow died, you have to go through a bunch of stuff all over again. However, Jet Fusion had a more or less free camera. Here, however, your camera is partially locked. It can be moved around freely horizontally, but you are not allowed to do much in the way of vertical camera movement, and it will immediately be snapped back to center. But the biggest problem with this game? Well, at some point you're going to have to attack enemies with some sort of ranged weapon. Well, okay, one of two ranged weapons, one which devolves certain Twonkies, and the other which captures the small ones. That shouldn't be a problem though, right? It shouldn't be. Except for the fact that there is literally zero lock-on system. Now, those who have tried dual-stick aiming in games know how much of a hassle this can be. But since Jimmy's movement can also move the camera along, and because of how the camera works in this game, it's more like 1.5 stick aiming. I get it, this game doesn't have any gyro controls because it was the 2000s. But lock-on systems in games do exist. We had this figured out by 1998, guys. By 2005, this should have been standard if we were going for this sort of fighting system. Why am I complaining about this so much? Well, for a start, I ended up fighting the camera more than anything else during these combat sections, since there is very little auto-aim for these weapons. Second of all, there are a couple of buttons that could be used for lock-on. Let's take a look at the typical GameCube controller for a second. We've got your typical movement controls, then we have B to use a weapon, X swaps between the two most important weapons in the game, one which devolves enemies, and another which captures them. Y is your use button, even if that probably could have been mapped to B due to how little combat and using things actually overlap, but there's no complaint here. R is used as a dedicated button for the invention menu. I mean, you probably could have shoved that into the pause menu, but okay, that's fine. Even the D-pad is used, this being for switching to certain inventions, most of which I actually don't think I even used. And then the L button. The perfect button to use for a lock-on system, right? Press L to target an enemy. The L button centers the camera behind Jimmy. I mean, my point still sort of stands, actually. I only used this a couple of times throughout the game because it really wasn't helping with the issue at hand. This could have easily been adapted into a proper lock-on system, but for some reason, it just wasn't. So we have a game which should have used the lock-on system, and the perfect button to use it on, but instead we get nothing. While I only died maybe a couple of times in the entire game, one due to being sniped from off-screen by an enemy I couldn't see, I can't deny that the combat in this game was tedious. I'll also add that I did like these arcade mini-games, and the music reminded me of Sonic Adventure of all things. Maybe it reminds me of the first section of Twinkle Park or something. Now, with that all being said, is this the worst game ever? No, not by a long shot. In fact, it's one of the best Jimmy Neutron games in here. I just think that the combat could have been done far better. I'm still baffled by the fact that it wasn't. Oh, right, we also have a GBA game to cover. Now, I honestly didn't play much of this game, because the controls are back to being not very good. That sucks because the previous game was actually pretty decent, but here? Well, okay, let's actually start out with the visuals before anything else. The visuals look like the 3D renders were crushed down to GBA size and turned into sprites. Why? The previous GBA game had pretty decent sprite work, all things considered. Were they not allowed to use those? But oh, let's get to that control issue. Do you see this? No, this isn't just a stupid bit for the video. I'm actually having this much difficulty getting up here, to a point where I thought I was doing something wrong. No, it's just that the level's height limit seems to be so low that you'll hit the ceiling before you can get this item. Maybe there's some item from later in the game I'm missing, but otherwise I have no clue how else I can get this item. Now, I don't know if these are necessary to continue the game either way, but between that and having to use this pathetic slide kick to try and beat the boss, yeah, I think I'm done here. I can already tell from the first couple of levels this won't be all that great. Alright, and on to the other games I found. Don't worry, I'll go through these quickly. These are mainly web games, and I'll just be going in mostly alphabetical order of what I found by searching Jimmy Neutron on the Flashpoint archive. We're actually going to skip the first game, since it's basically just a find the hidden object game from what I can tell. So to start off this portion properly, we have Jimmy Neutron Cookie Time. In this game, you have to run from a dinosaur while throwing cookies at it to stall it, or eating a cookie for yourself to regain energy. Honestly, this whole game is hilarious. From how Jimmy's voice sounds, to the running animations, and how the dinosaur just sort of stalls in place and looks like this. I didn't say it was a good game, but it made me laugh. Next up, we have Jimmy Neutron Hypercorn. Interesting title aside, this involves Jimmy dreaming about creamed corn. This game is notably incredibly bare bones. I mean, look at this level intro screen, but then you get bombarded by whatever's going on here. Unfortunately, this game has one major flaw. The blocks are all diagonally oriented, which means let's say I want to go over to this block. So do I press down since it's below me, or right because it's to the right of me? Well, I have a 50-50 chance here, so yeah, if you get it wrong, Jimmy will happily just jump down to his death. I will say one thing for this game though, the death scream is actually hilarious. That reminds me so much of the Senor Pelo scream, so bonus points for that. Now you have Jimmy Neutron in The Big Freeze. It's basically a point-and-click shooting game. Not much to add, but it's fun enough. Just shoot the Yokians, and that's about it. Alright, here's Invention Revenge. Oh boy, a 3D game. An early Jimmy Neutron 3D game. Okay, you know the bit here. Let's see what awful controls this has. Wait, WASD? And mouse look? You can even jump in this one, even though it isn't mentioned in the controls.
God, you are real!
This is incredible! So, let me just make sure I have this right. The Jimmy Neutron PC game from 2001 didn't have good controls. You know, that one that was a full release of a game? The one that cost money? But a random Shockwave game from the same era does. I feel like this is running on a modified Quake engine, given both the movement and the sounds, though that isn't a complaint by any means. This game was fun enough that I even played it through to the end, even if that was only 3 levels. We have Jimmy's Lab, which is way more expansive than it normally is, Downtown Retroville, and Jimmy's high school? Also, I think that final level is the weirdest one. The first one is far more expansive than Jimmy's lab should be. The second one is actually mostly normal since it just takes place in a downtown area. But the third one? Why are there a bunch of tunnels snaking around the inside of the school? Originally, I thought these were just supposed to be weirdly shaped vents, but I don't think so. Especially since they're giant, and one of them even comes out of the bleachers. Well, whatever. Still a decent game all around. Pain, go away. So Cindy took Jimmy's pain transfer device, and you have to find Cindy somewhere in the level before she induces too much pain. Also, there are evil dentists who will inflict pain too, but wandering around searching in this tiny portion of screen area was actually getting annoying, so I decided to stop the game. There didn't seem to be a ton to it anyway. C-. You're getting chased by a giant fish. Yeah, doesn't this seem a bit familiar? It isn't quite as bare bones as the dinosaur one, but there really isn't a ton to it. You swim through each stage and rescue whoever is at the end. Space Blast. You fly through space shooting asteroids. Honestly, a pretty decent and competently made game all around, with the exception of certain areas where you can just phase through collision. Something tells me that portion isn't supposed to happen. There isn't a ton to add, but it's pretty good all the same. Ultralord versus the Squirrels. So despite the title, it doesn't seem like you actually get to play as Ultralord. Instead you play as Jimmy in a very bare-bones Pac-Man clone. But hey, instead of collecting power pellets which put you on a timer, instead you can collect golden acorns and just throw them at the squirrels. Also, a quick question, but what is this sound effect called? I heard it in this game, as well as a couple of the others I played for this, but I don't know what it's called or where it originates from. Alright, moving on. Alien Invasion. This game is a puzzle game where you have to line up 4 alien ships in a line, and do so enough times to reach the goal for a level. You can actually move a ship basically anywhere on the board so long as it's accessible from where the ship currently is, so that's actually pretty good. The only thing of note is how this game is opened. Flashpoint opened this and a couple of other games in its own browser window. I assumed to trick the game into thinking it was connected to the original site, which is actually a pretty clever trick for games that don't want to run off of the original site. Backyard Smash Ball is a very simple baseball game against the Yokians, and by very simple, I mean it's literally just hitting or throwing the ball. You don't even get to go around bases in this game. There are some funny moments when hitting the ball if you send it far enough, and you can pitch the ball in a way where the Yokians will strike out every single time, but yeah, that's about it for this game. Baggerbot. Uh-oh, this one's in German. Okay, hold on, let me read the instructions here in my very fluent German. I'm just gonna be reading all this first try. Mistakes and all. Jimmy Neutron hat einen Roboter gebaut, in Bergwerken nach seltenen Elementen zu suchen. Du kannst das Gravitationsfeld des Roboters mit den Fehltasten links und rechts beeinflussen, den Roboter zu steuern. Achte auf das Radar. Es zeigt die Position der Elemente und des Ausgangs an. Spiel starten. That was horrible. I'm sorry if you speak German, I don't speak your language. So pretty much in this game, you just roll around collecting materials before going on to the next level. Do you remember the special stages from Sonic 1? Well, it sort of controls like that. Not the best game ever, but not terrible either. Busca Especial. Alright, now this one's in what seems like Spanish. Or maybe Portuguese. And this one isn't even official from what I can tell. But I accidentally started it anyway, so let's see how this goes. You can fly around as a cardboard cutout of Jimmy, where you collect capsules before entering this spaceship near the bottom. Oh, and don't forget the part where some assets are stored off-screen, which always makes it funny playing these games on a modern widescreen monitor. I did notice at one point that Jimmy started moving before I had even pressed an input, so I decided to not press anything and see if Jimmy could win by doing literally nothing. And he actually did! He just acted like the DVD logo, and he was able to hit the corner twice. Okay, moving on now. Here's Carl Squared. You just fire at the glowing corals, but not the original not glowing one. This is an okay game, except due to the window size, I have so little room to move my mouse that any rapid movement causes issues. Flip and flow. So this game uses the 2D designs from the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour specials. I have no idea why, but regardless, this is one of those environmental things Nick was doing for a while, so it's all about conserving water and such. It's a fine puzzle game, but not all that interesting. J game. I don't know what this is exactly, aside from looking a bit bootlegged in spots. But this is apparently from the Nick website, so it's official. But there's only one level anyway, with the rest being locked behind a login page. It's a basic 2D side-scrolling shooter, which probably would have been decent if it didn't look so off. Lightspeed Liftoff. This involves Jimmy collecting his clothes, I guess? It's difficult to tell what's going on in this game, in part due to the horrible frame rate, and since Jimmy is usually blocking off roughly a third of the playable area at all times. Sorry, the frame rate is bothering me, so I'm going to have to pass on this one. New Dog, Old Tricks. For some reason, this one is labeled as Old Dog New Tricks in Flashpoint. Whatever the case, this is just a Simon clone. Just repeat what Cindy's dog does. At least some of the animations are kind of funny. Now then, one of these is called Jimmy Neutron Rescue Jet Fusion, named after the episode of the same name. This was made not as a Flash game, but as a 3D Groove GX game. Now you might be wondering,
The fuck is that?
well, it turns out this was a 3D game engine for web games, which was shut down all the way back in 2009. Obviously, it could be done well enough in Shockwave, but let's see how this game is. Well, I think I'm stuck on the first level. The input doesn't seem to work all that well, as forward input is intermittent at best. That, and I think the game is just a bit broken in general, with a bad frame rate, poor movement, and I don't think Jimmy is supposed to be constantly T-posing like this. Well, that sucks. The game looked somewhat interesting. U-Boot Abentur. Uh-oh, more German. Deine Aufgabe ist es, alle Fische aus einem gefährdeten Korallenriff zu retten, aber du musst den U-Boot vorsichtig manövrieren. In der Unterwasserwelt lauern überall Gefahren. Wer mit den Kontakt mit Wasser schlagen und verquallen. Sie konnten den Tagboot angreifen, ach das Korallenriff oder Wasserpflanzen solltest du nicht berühren. Sobald du deine Fische oder Schätze mit deinem Lichtstrahl getötet hast, werden sie automatisch an Bord gesaugt. Speed starten. I at least understood that last part. Okay, this game isn't anything to write home about. It's perfectly serviceable, where you just go around collecting fish and treasure until you get enough to move on to the next level. But what I want to highlight is the music that plays here. It's almost a shame that this music piece is stuck in this game, because I could hear it as being some perfectly good underwater music. Perhaps a bit chunky in parts, but otherwise good. Now we have the Nick.com Jimmy Neutron page. But honestly, there isn't a ton to add here. Some character profiles or taking the "Which Jimmy Neutron character are you?" quiz would be neat, but it seems like we don't have any of that stuff. Instead, we have a basic listing of when Jimmy Neutron would air, as well as many of the games that we've already played. Oh, and by the way, did you think we were done with Attack of the Twonkies? Nope, we have one more game, and it's sort of the worst one yet. It's just flying around with rather slippery controls trying to capture Twonkies in a time limit, all while you can pick up Sheen so that he can start terribly singing. Not much to add here, it just isn't all that great. Okay, so finally, we're done with Jimmy Neutron games, right? Well, almost. We forgot the Jimmy Timmy games. We'll get through these quickly. This first one is Retroville Rescue, where you have to rescue Cindy from Dr. Calamitous. It's just a puzzle game with a level builder, which is actually pretty cool. Play as Timmy, by the way. He has an actual ranged weapon, while Jimmy has bubbles.
Fucking bubbles!
The only other thing of note here is the resolution, which is all over the place. The title screen is at full screen, but as soon as you hit play, you get kicked out into what's maybe 360p at most. This second one is Co-Pilot Chaos, made for the second special. For some reason, this game feels slightly familiar, and yet at the same time I feel like I don't recognize it at all. Maybe I played this years ago and I just don't remember it anymore. It's another 2D shmup. It's fine, better than the previous one I covered, except you have no actual shooting ability. Yeah, you have to either fly over enemies and drop things on them, or get close enough to punch them. Yeah, I'll pass on this one. And finally, we have Shirley's Revenge. Now this one is just annoying, mainly due to the controls of this vehicle here. Also, this vortex effect he can do can and will drag you off course, and while that makes sense, it's still quite annoying. Look, I don't care for this game, just like I don't really care for this special to begin with. Alright, that finally concludes all of the Jimmy Neutron games that I'm aware of. I'm sure someone's going to tell me that I forgot the Jimmy Neutron game for the N-Gage, but otherwise, that's everything. So, Jimmy Neutron games are sort of a mixed bag. We had one okay GBA game, two bad ones, and an actually pretty decent one. The first console game was kind of rough, but not the worst thing ever, while the later two were actually pretty decent all things considered. And the PC games...
It sucks! Monkey butts like all the fucking rest!
Okay, the actual full games released for PC were actually pretty awful. I think these would be okay if only the controls weren't absolute garbage. Meanwhile, the Flash games were... certainly a mixed bag. Though, again, I must ask, how did a Shockwave game manage to have better controls than the full release PC games? Could the PC games not be released with control modifications or something? Guys, WASD is a thing you can do, and by 2001 should have been more or less standard, or at the very least an option. I shouldn't have to go using third-party programs to desperately try and fix the controls for the game. But I'm getting sidetracked. Let's get to the conclusion. Now, when I mentioned the design of the series near the beginning of this video, I'm sure some people thought that I was complaining about it or something, but I actually really like how this series looks. It sort of emphasizes that 2000s look of everything. I'm also glad that they didn't do what some graphic designers did during this time by setting the bloom to as high as it could possibly go, which looks awful. However, I think this is also another point against any sort of sequel, and adds on to why I think this series could never be replicated. I think a modern design for this show would make it lose much of its charm. Certain things would just feel too off somehow, more than likely either in the lighting or detail aspects. So, whatever happened to Jimmy Neutron anyway? And why didn't it ever really continue? Well, that's because the company behind it closed. How can that be though? Jimmy Neutron was on a roll. What could have happened to cause things to fall apart so quickly? Well, has anyone heard of a little movie called The Ant Bully? This was basically the company betting everything on red, and then failing completely. Okay, to be fair, I haven't watched a movie in a very, very long time, but I remember the movie being just okay at best, and sometimes just not good. And it seems like a lot of others thought so, because the movie got mediocre ratings all around, and managed to lose... Wait, hang on a second. It made its budget back? Oh, wait, sorry, just barely. And given some of the expenses involved with that, I wouldn't be surprised if it would have at the very least cost the company a fair amount. But according to what I could find, the company simply had no future projects planned, and so they closed. Honestly, I could think of worse endings, and I suppose it's very fitting to my thoughts on Jimmy Neutron. You see, Jimmy Neutron as a show is a product of its time. It's certainly good for what it's worth, and nearly everything about it as a show is enjoyable. Most episodes made me laugh, but with only a couple of episodes truly being what I'd consider bad. I've said it before, but I always far prefer a show which doesn't get forcibly stretched out far too long, And funnily enough, DNA Productions did this exact thing. The show ended when it ended, and that was about it. In fact, let's tackle the question people have probably already thought of. Should Jimmy Neutron get a reboot? Since this has to be said for what seems like any show that has ever been remotely popular, should the show get a reboot? No! Okay, look, I might have a bit of an anti-reboot bias, which I might make an entire video about sometime in the future. However, the big problem with reboots is that for every one that's done right, there are at least a dozen more that are done terribly, and I can all but guarantee you that a reboot of this show would fall into the latter category. Not only because of simple odds, but because of what the show was like to begin with. The animation still holds up fairly well, but was certainly a product of its time. I worry that a Jimmy Neutron reboot, especially now, would go too far in making the animation look new and exciting, ironically sacrificing part of what made the show good. There's also the characters and stories, which I think would suffer too. Everyone's seen the memes of Hugh, but I worry what would end up happening is the producers of the show try too hard to end up making more memes or something, and end up being incredibly unfunny in the process. Think of it like how modern SpongeBob changed its animation style to no doubt try and force more memes into existence. Let's face it, Jimmy Neutron was a show for its time that did its job really well. Not every series needs a reboot or spin-off. In fact, let's talk about the elephant in the room really quick. Jimmy Neutron did have a sort of spin-off called Planet Sheen, and it is Exhibit A as to why we do not need a Jimmy Neutron reboot. Allow me to say something crazy. As an entire series, I honestly preferred Jimmy Neutron to SpongeBob. Now, look, part of that is because SpongeBob kept going while Jimmy Neutron didn't, unless you count Planet Sheen, but I don't. If we were to compare the first 3 seasons of each, I'd obviously go for SpongeBob. As it is though, I prefer Jimmy Neutron to be a finished series that I can look back on and generally enjoy, rather than watch rot in the present. Maybe that's even my deal with a lot of modern media. I can't stand reboots or spin-offs most of the time because I hate seeing a franchise slowly succumb to rot. I think Red Letter Media puts it best though.
How does it feel to have lived long enough to see all of your favorite franchises go down in flames?
Feels great.
If it had been my way, SpongeBob would have ended after the first movie. No future seasons, no weird spin-offs, and so forth. While Jimmy Neutron still got a spin-off, most people are happy to ignore it. I just want a really good series to be spared the fate of SpongeBob. Some might say that there's no such thing as too much of a good thing, but it's when that thing stops being good that it's too much. And I'd rather things end on a high note too early than wait and see how long it takes to crash and burn. To conclude, in case it wasn't obvious, I really like Jimmy Neutron. Sure, it had a couple of rough episodes, and I think that the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour had a bit of a lame ending, but the series is quite good overall. Ironically enough, one of the weakest parts of the series was the very beginning with the movie. The movie was just sort of okay, and didn't get nearly as insane as the main series, so despite the fact the movie took place in space, it all ironically felt a bit too grounded and down to earth. Otherwise, this series is really just insane, and I love it for that. That still doesn't mean that it needs a reboot though. I called this show impossible to replicate, and I say that without the slightest hint of irony. I seriously don't think one could replicate Jimmy Neutron in the modern day, not even the original creators of the show, certainly not for any length of time. It would either try too much to be serious, or try to play into the memes too much. Jimmy Neutron, more than anything, is a show that arguably needs to be studied for just how bizarre it truly is. Well, that's all for now. Thank y'all for watching, and take care. Alright, hey everybody. Yeah, this video took a while. Over a couple of months, actually. I know that some people were thinking something had happened or I'd just abandoned the channel for some reason, but that obviously isn't the case considering you just watched this over an hour-and-a-half long Jimmy Neutron video I made. So what did happen? Well, honestly, I think part of my issue was not being able to focus my attention on just one video. I knew shortly after starting this video that it would take a long time to make, so partway through making it, I decided, you know what, let me pause working on this for a bit and work on something shorter. The goal being to have something a bit smaller in there before the really big video came out. This was a good idea in theory, but it didn't actually pan out all that well. I started at least 3 other projects during this time, one of which didn't become much of anything, while the other 2 became giant in terms of scope, so I realized I would have to put those on hold as well if I ever want to get this video finished. So ironically, by trying to make smaller videos to tide people over while I made this bigger video, it actually made the wait for this video even longer. Now, I'm sure people are wondering if waits this long are going to be the norm going forward. To that I must say, I sure hope not. This video was a challenge to make, and even though I probably could have gotten it done in a month or less had it been my sole focus, giant videos which approach the 2-hour mark aren't exactly something I want to be doing regularly. I'm hoping to aim for an upload schedule something more like once every week or 2, but I guess we'll see how that goes. Anyway, I just wanted to briefly mention at the end here what happened with this video and why it took so long. Well, thank y'all for watching, and take care.
Things gonna like jump out at us and scare us. Ah!